So, we are in Leviticus chapter 26. Pastor Cullen and I had planned this out that I'd have 2 more weeks to finish up Leviticus. And he went faster, and so we only have today to finish Leviticus. I'm going to focus more of my time in chapter 26, just because I think this is important. It's a part of the Bible that repeats in a number of places. It's the blessings and the curses for obedience or for disobedience to what God has laid out as his plan. And we find that not only here in Leviticus, we also find it in Exodus, we also find it in Deuteronomy, and it is actually a very standard form that is not unique to the Bible, that any king, any conquering king, any liberating king, when he would establish his kingdom, he would lay out the rules for his kingdom. This is how things operate in my realm. And there was usually a document that was written. It would begin by stating all the things that the king or the ruler had done for the people that were his subjects. And we don't see that quite so much here. It's very brief in one spot where it says, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of bondage from Egypt." But in Deuteronomy, it's laid out more completely. But here we have the blessings and curses, which is the end of how this treaty would be established between the vassal subjects and the king, the suzerain king. And so God here is the king, he's the ruler. He's laid out throughout the book of Leviticus all the things that needed to be followed. And now he gets to, this is what's going to happen if you obey me. And this is what's going to happen if you just disobey. And so there are the blessings, and that's the first section, and that goes through verse 13. And then the second section are the curses, and that's 14 through the end of the chapter.
What chapter?
We're in chapter 26 of Leviticus. And so if you notice real quickly that there's 13 verses on the blessings, and then there are verse 14 through verse 46. In other words, there's 32 verses on the curses. And this is actually quite normal. There was more time spent on the curses. And actually, the curses serve to reinforce the blessings, because if you don't do what's wrong, if you don't disobey, then all the curses are not going to befall you. And so it's actually not as negative as one might think. So let's start out here in chapter 26, verse 1. We get a kind of a summary. It says, "Do not make idols or set up an image or sacred stone for yourselves, and do not place a carved stone in your land to bow down before it. I am the Lord your God." So the first command we have here, and this is a little bit before we get to the blessings, which start in verse 3, is don't worship idols. Don't make an idol. Don't bow down to an idol. Don't set up for yourself anything that is in opposition to God. And so for the Israelites, there was a lot of temptation because of where they had come from in Egypt and where they were going to in Canaan, that practiced idolatry, that had gods with a small g, that they would worship, that they would depend upon to provide the things that they needed. And for an agrarian society that depended on rain for the crops, that depended on rain to make the grasses grow so that the cattle could graze and so the animals would have feed and so that the people would have their harvest, that required rain. And so there was a big tendency to establish some god that was going to provide rain. And so there were the gods of Egypt, there were the gods of Canaan, and God, the Lord God, he says, none of those should be worshipped. None of those means should be dependent upon. I am the one that provides the rain. I am the one that sustains life. And so that was a very clear directive to the Israelites. It's interesting that throughout the Israelite history, what was their problem? Idolatry. They were always running to idols. They were always looking for ways to provide for themselves apart from God. So when they got themselves in trouble, they would take on the different idols, the different gods with a small g of the peoples around them. And then they would also go to other countries to get their armies to help fight their wars rather than depending on the Lord. So they were idolatrous. So let's just set aside Leviticus for a minute and let's look at our lives. Do we have a tendency to be idolatrous as well?
Sure.
Yes. What are some of the idols that we set up for ourselves? What are some of the things that we put or have a tendency to put, or people have a tendency to put in the place of God today? Money. In other words, the money that I have in my bank account, my wealth or the benefits that I've accumulated, the security of my job, the promise of a retirement, those are things that can cause us to become autonomously independent of God and not depend on Him. Okay? Anything else?
Government, health care, and
Government, we can depend upon the government to provide for us, and so we will vote for those people that will provide for us rather than vote for those people who will uphold justice. And so we will sacrifice righteousness and justice for benefits that we can get. Okay? Anything else?
Happiness.
Explain a little bit more how that substitutes God.
No, I think many people search for other gods, asking for happiness.
Okay, so is it wrong to seek for happiness as a Christian?
Not as Christian, of course, we have to look for the God.
Okay, so we as Christians we find our happiness in God. But so happiness in itself is not an idol, but what we pursue to obtain that happiness
All right.
can be the idol.
I got you.
Okay? So the desire to be happy and to enjoy life is actually good. That's nothing wrong with that. So long as it comes through God and through the means that He provides, and that we're not going a different way to get that. Okay, so some people would seek happiness through sinful behavior.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so those sinful behaviors to provide the happiness that only God should be providing for us can be our idols.
Okay.
Okay? Anything else?
Cars.
Huh?
Cars.
Cars. Yes. Cars, houses, things that we sacrifice the things of God and doing the things of God to obtain these possessions that make us feel good about ourselves, that provide us with status and power or the perception of that. Okay? So, we are not immune to idolatry. We are not immune to idolatry. So, it was forbidden for the Israelites. It's forbidden for us as Christians. We're told to not set anything up in opposition to God, that we need to follow Him wholeheartedly with all that we do, and that He is the one that provides for us. He may provide for us through the job we have, but if that job requires us to disobey God, requires us to do things that God has prohibited, then what do? We follow God. And if we lose our job because of that, we can lose our job knowing that God will provide for us through another means. Okay? That is faith. We talk about having faith. Faith says that, God, I believe in you. And if I'm asked to lie or cheat or steal in my job or defraud someone else or take advantage of people, then I can't do that job. Okay, so we have to be careful. Okay, verse 2. Observe my Sabbaths and have reverence for my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Interesting that of all the things that could be picked, these are the two that get picked. Observe my Sabbaths and have reverence for my sanctuary. Why pick these two?
Because these are the places where God lives. God exists for us in His church.
So, we have 6 days, and then the seventh day is the Sabbath. So God has separated out this day as a time for us to refresh ourselves, to focus on God, to be in communion with Him and with His people. Okay, welcome. And then these are the days that we get to work. When we forget the Sabbath, what are we forgetting?